The letter on the doorstep. Eleanor Street in Bath was usually quiet at dawn. Margaret Ellis, a retired schoolteacher, began her mornings with the same routine, boiling the kettle, opening the curtains, and glancing at the cobbled path outside her townhouse. On that particular morning, she noticed an envelope resting neatly on the doorstep. It was cream-colored, sealed with red wax, and addressed simply, "For Margaret." She frowned. The handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned. She had no relatives who would send such a letter, and no neighbors with such flair. Her pulse quickened as she tore the wax and unfolded the paper inside. The letter read, "I confess to a crime long forgotten. A life was taken. The truth was buried. Only you will understand what must come next." Margaret's hands trembled. The words were not signed, but the detail in the handwriting struck her. Something about the curve of the letters felt familiar, as though she had seen it before in another lifetime. Her mind rushed back to her years as a young woman, when she had first arrived in Bath, before she was married. She remembered whispers of scandal then, a disappearance no one spoke of after. Could it be related? She placed the letter on the kitchen table, staring at it as the kettle screamed. She had taught hundreds of children, seen neighbors come and go, lived an ordinary, almost invisible life. Who would send this to her, and why now? Another thought struck her suddenly. What if someone was watching her? The curtains were still half open. She slowly moved to the window, heart pounding, and scanned the street outside. For a moment, she was certain she saw the outline of a figure standing at the corner, unmoving, watching her house. When she blinked, the figure was gone. Margaret clutched the letter tighter. She could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That night, Margaret barely slept. Every creak of the old townhouse made her heart jolt. She left the first letter folded on her bedside table, as if keeping it close might help her make sense of it. But by morning, nothing was clearer, only heavier. When she opened her front door to fetch the milk, she froze. A second envelope lay on the same spot as before. The same cream paper. The same red wax. This time, the wax bore a faint impression of a rose. Her hand shook as she picked it up and carried it inside. She hesitated before breaking the seal. The letter within was longer. "You think the past can stay hidden, but shadows always rise. Do you remember the winter of '72, by the river bridge? You were there. You saw more than you should have." Margaret dropped the paper as though it burned her skin. She staggered backwards until her chair caught her. 72. The winter when she was barely 19. The winter she had tried so hard to forget. The image flooded her mind, icy water beneath the bridge, the sound of laughter that turned to a scream, and a young woman's scarf floating away downstream. She had told herself it was an accident, and she had sworn never to speak of it. No one knew she had been there. No one but her. Her throat tightened. Whoever wrote these letters knew too much. But how? And why send them now, after 50 years? She forced herself to read the final line. "You cannot hide forever. Soon, we will meet again." Margaret's stomach knotted. Her eyes darted to the window, but the street outside lay silent. The ordinary clink of the milk van leaving bottles on a neighbor's step was the only sound. Yet when she turned back to the table, her blood ran cold. Both letters, the first and the second, were gone. Margaret searched the kitchen frantically. The table was bare, the floor untouched. She checked the bin, the counters, even the hallway carpet. The letters had vanished as if they had never existed. Her hands shook as she steadied herself on the dresser. She pulled open one of its drawers, desperate to find something that proved she was not losing her mind. Instead, she found an object she had not seen in years, a black and white photograph. It was tucked between old bills and recipe cards, but it had not been there before. She was certain of it. The picture showed 3 young women standing by the river bridge. She recognized her own face immediately, youthful and smiling. Beside her was Alice Morton, her closest friend in those days, and another girl, Rose. Margaret's stomach tightened. Rose. The girl who had vanished that winter. Her breath caught as she examined the photo. Someone had drawn a faint line of ink around Rose's figure, circling her, as if marking her as the center of it all. Beneath, scrawled in the same elegant handwriting as the letters, were the words, "You cannot erase the past." Margaret dropped the photo, her vision blurring. No one else had this picture. She had burned all of them years ago, after Rose disappeared. She remembered tossing them into the fire, watching them curl and blacken into ash. Her knees buckled. Had someone saved this one? Or had someone been there, in the shadows, keeping their own copy all along? A sudden noise startled her, the unmistakable sound of her letterbox clattering open and shut. Slowly, she turned her head towards the front door. Another envelope had just slid onto the mat. Margaret stared at the envelope on the doormat, paralyzed by dread. It seemed to glow in the dim light of the hallway, daring her to pick it up. At last, with trembling fingers, she crouched and tore the wax seal. The note inside was short. "You are not alone in that house. Go to the stairs." Her breath froze. She looked towards the staircase, the wooden banister rising into shadow. Every instinct told her not to move, yet her legs carried her forward. The air felt colder with each step. Halfway up, a board creaked beneath her foot. She froze, listening. At first there was silence, and then, soft as a whisper, a voice. It came from above. Margaret. Her name, spoken with a faint echo, as though carried on the breath of the house itself. Margaret clutched the banister to steady herself. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. "Who's there?" she whispered hoarsely, though she knew no one would answer. Yet the voice came again, clearer this time. "You left me." Her knees buckled. The words sliced through her like a blade. She had heard those exact words once before, half a century ago, by the riverbank. Rosie's face, pale and frightened, flashed before her eyes. The hallway light flickered overhead. Margaret forced herself to take another step, her hands slick with sweat. At the top of the stairs, the door to her old guest room stood ajar, swaying slightly as though someone had just passed through. And from within came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards. Margaret forced herself to the top of the stairs. The guest room door groaned as she pushed it wider. A stale draft swept past her, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the glow of a street lamp filtering through thin curtains. The furniture was coated with dust, untouched for years. Yet on the center of the bed lay something that should not have been there. A showbox. Her trembling hands lifted the lid. Inside were scraps of blackened paper, photographs, diaries, and letters that she had burned long ago. The edges were singed, the ink half melted, but she recognized them instantly. Among the fragments was Rosie's face, frozen in a photograph, staring back at her with hollow eyes. Margaret staggered backwards, clutching the bedpost. "No, this isn't possible." The air thickened, pressing against her chest. She heard it then, the sound of breathing. Not hers. Slow, deliberate, and close. Her gaze darted to the far corner of the room. Shadows pooled there, darker than the rest, as though gathering into form. For a moment, she swore she saw the outline of a girl, long hair falling across her face, arms limp by her side. "Margaret," the whisper was ragged now, filled with grief and accusation. The showbox slipped from her grasp and crashed to the floor. Ash scattered across the rug like grey snow. Suddenly, the curtains whipped open though the window was shut. Papers whirled into the air, circling her in a storm of charred fragments. Margaret shielded her face, but one piece clung to her hand. She peeled it away and froze. It was a torn photograph of herself, standing on the riverbank, staring down into the water. Beneath her image, scrawled in the same elegant hand, were the words, "You pushed her." Margaret fled from the room, stumbling down the stairs, her breath ragged. She pressed her back against the front door, desperate to escape, but her legs would not carry her outside. The house felt alive now, every wall whispering, every floorboard groaning. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the wood behind her head. Margaret froze, staring at the door handle. Whoever it was had not used the letterbox this time. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Standing in the porch light was Alice Morton. Her childhood friend. The girl from the photograph. Her hair was grey now, her face lined, but the eyes, those unmistakable eyes, were the same. Margaret's voice cracked. "Alice, you're alive." Alice gave a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course I'm alive. You never wondered why I left Bath so suddenly? Why I disappeared?" Margaret could barely breathe. "I thought you moved away. I thought you wanted to forget." Alice's gaze hardened. "Forget? Margaret, how could anyone forget what happened that night?" The name hung between them like smoke. Rose. Alice stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the hallway floor. "I've been watching you. I know about the letters. About the photograph. And I know what you did." Margaret's knees weakened. Her hand slid down the wall for balance. "I didn't," she stammered, but Alice raised her hand sharply. "You were there. You saw her fall. But you didn't tell the truth, did you? You never told anyone." The silence between them stretched unbearably. Outside, the night air carried the distant toll of the Abbey bells. Alice leaned closer, her whisper cutting through the stillness. "And now, Margaret, it's time you faced her." Alice insisted they leave the house. Her eyes, fierce and unblinking, offered no room for refusal. Margaret wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, though the night air bit through it like knives. Side by side, though far apart in spirit, they walked the silent streets of Bath. The bells had stopped ringing. Only the sound of their footsteps echoed against the stone walls. Margaret longed to speak, to defend herself, but Alice's silence weighed heavier than words. At last, Alice turned down a narrow path that sloped towards the Avon. The river glimmered faintly under the moon, its surface restless with winter's current. Margaret halted at the sight of the bridge, the very place that had haunted her for half a century. Her breath caught. She whispered, almost pleading, "Alice, must we go there?" Alice did not answer. She strode onto the bridge, her shadow stretching long across the stones. Margaret followed, her legs trembling as if the weight of her past had settled in her bones. When they reached the center, Alice turned, her face pale in the moonlight. "This is where it happened." The night rose disappeared. The name chilled the air. Margaret felt her throat close. "I never touched her." She slipped. "The ice." Alice cut her off. "No." She screamed your name. "I heard it. And then you ran." Margaret shook her head violently, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was frightened. I was a child. I didn't know what to do." The river roared below them, as though calling out the truth. Alice stepped closer, her voice low but unyielding. "You left her, Margaret. You left her to drown." Margaret gripped the cold stone of the bridge, her knuckles white. The memory surged back, unbidden, the swirl of water, Rose's hand reaching up, her lips forming one last word. "Margaret." The very same voice she had heard in her house. And now, it rose again, not in her mind, but from the dark waters below. The voice rose from the river, soft yet unrelenting, like the tide itself. Margaret stumbled back, clutching her chest, her breath ragged. Alice's eyes widened, but she did not flinch. She had waited her whole life for this. The waters churned as though stirred by unseen hands. Then, faintly, the outline of a girl emerged beneath the current, pale as moonlight, her hair drifting like dark ribbons. "Rose," Margaret whispered, her knees weakening. The apparition did not climb from the river, nor did it vanish. It lingered, watching, her gaze sorrowful but accusing. Alice spoke with trembling resolve. "It was never about what you meant to do. It was about what you failed to do. You left her, Aunt. You let her die alone." Margaret fell to her knees on the stone bridge, her tears spilling freely. "I was afraid they would blame me. Afraid Father would beat me. Afraid of the truth. And so I ran." Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs. "But I have lived with her cries in my ears every night since. That was my punishment." The river swelled, its sound growing louder, as if accepting her confession. Alice, shaken though she was, stepped forward. She placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement of the weight now laid bare. "You cannot change what you did," Alice said softly. "But you can stop hiding." Margaret raised her head, her wrinkled face glistening with tears. The apparition of Rose seemed to bow its head, then slowly dissolved back into the river's restless flow. For the first time in decades, silence fell, not haunted, but emptied. Margaret closed her eyes. "Then let it be finished. Let her rest." Alice looked out across the water, her heart torn between grief and release. The river carried on, endless and unyielding, as though the past had finally been spoken into its depths. But as they turned to leave the bridge, a final ripple stirred behind them, one last whisper of Rosie's name carried on the night wind, reminding them both that the dead are never truly silent.